So, welcome back to my thesis diary. Um, as I'm going through this, it may come out that all these episodes end up being the same length of time, but some might be shorter, some might be longer, depending upon how busy I am. We have not quite started classes yet. It is still summer for me. So, for the first couple of weeks, I'm just going to talk about kind of the why and talk a little bit more about the work itself. And it'll hopefully lead into conversations about the actual play itself. But today, I kind of want to talk about adaptation as function, as art, and then talk a little bit about why I've chosen to adapt Cinderella. Um, so, the first thing to talk about is adaptation. You might know adaptation by other names. I thought pretty hard about this actually, and I think things that parody things, it's a very close cousin of adaptation. So, like the Bugs Bunny, Elmer Fudd opera episodes of Looney Tunes is somewhat of an adaptation. It's a form of parody, but it's very much teaching about the story. That really is what adaptation is. Adaptation at its heart is looking at something that already exists and either putting a twist on it, sometimes just slapping a couple new characters in the scenario, and it's super reductive, which is when adaptation goes bad and people really don't like it. Specifically in the case of Cinderella, the Amazon one, where they roped Billy Porter and Idina Menzel into something that they were probably much too good for even at that point. And that's sort of a thing that we saw was adaptation really grabbed hold of something like pastiche, which is where you take something out of time and put it into another time. So that version of Cinderella, Moulin Rouge is full of pastiche. They did that Nirvana song in the Moulin Rouge, which would not have been around when that when that song was happening. So there's kind of you have what you think of as adaptation in your brain. Uh, Potentially, if you're my generation, when you think of adaptation, the easiest one is, The Lion King is Hamlet with cats. The Little Mermaid is an adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's story. Um, but really, kind of the biggest adaptation of my generation, the generation after, is the one coming up this no, I think it's still in November. The one coming up this winter, which is Wicked the musical, which is an adaptation of both Wicked the book and Wicked the stage show, which is an adaptation of the Wizard of Oz books and sometimes a serial. The Wizard of Oz is a really interesting way to look at adaptation because almost none of the adaptations of it, even like dream sequences from that 70s show or the Muppet version, really reference the original source material. Most of our familiarity with the story and the adaptations thereof stem from the MGM movie. You do get some versions of the story, like in Once Upon a Time, the project with James Franco that happened that had a prequel vibe to it. The animated CGI ones where they try to go into other books, but most of the known Wizard of Oz lore is really based around the MGM film, which is much more of an adaptation of the stage show rather than of the book itself. Um, Adaptation is a very pervasive thing, and it's pervasive because it's easy is not the right word, but I'm going to use the word easy. The thing about adaptation is it's part of why I started my career in fan fiction was it gives you something to hang your hat on. It's not just about the formula of the plot. It might be about the character. It might be about the emotional beats. It might be about the setting, but it does give something familiar for you to start with. In a bad adaptation, it's just a straight adaptation. Nothing changes, or maybe like something is changed, but it's like a coat of paint. So when I think of potentially quote unquote bad adaptations, which there probably aren't as many. Like I think about the Sherlock Holmes that was done with Robert Downey Jr., where it was sort of a beat for beat from the books, but it was kind of Guy Ritchie. That's not necessarily bad. Maybe you really like that movie. And when I say bad adaptation, I'm not saying it's bad and worthless and there was nothing to learn from it. But that's just kind of a one for one. It's not really interesting. You're not necessarily saying something new. Maybe you're doing some visual effects. The Hobbit movies, which are an adaptation that was so entranced with like this new technology they were doing at the time where they were speeding up film even faster. Um, the Hobbit movies are an example of bad adaptation as well. Yeah, adding characters in that don't really add much to the story other than to give another female love interest, something more entranced with technology than was telling the story itself. That's kind of quote unquote bad adaptation. But there are good adaptations. I would argue Wicked is among them. Um, I would argue every time I see a post on the internet about the Muppets do something, that would count as good adaptation. The Muppet Christmas Carol is one of the most agreed upon great adaptations, not just by pop culture, but by people that studied Charles Dickens. They feel like it has not just the rhythm of it, but the spirit of it. And an interesting part about adaptation is that it adapts from movies as well as from the book because of how scenes are set in the order. If you read A Christmas Carol and watch a version of A Christmas Carol, um, sometimes the scenes are in order in who Ebenezer Scrooge visits, sometimes they aren't. Sometimes the premise goes pretty far out, like Diva, A Christmas Carol, which is actually one of my favorite adaptations. Um, but so an adaptation is really about familiarity. In some strains, it's about there is already an audience that either really likes or really hates a story. So you're sort of depending on that familiarity and the press and the baggage the story already has when you're telling it. Um, Part of what worked for The Little Mermaid, um, a part of what worked for The Little Mermaid was there have been a couple of adaptations done before, but not many. Splash with Daryl Hannah, I think, has some shades of it, though I think it's a little more off than a true adaptation. But The Little Mermaid had the benefit of Disney wasn't doing that well at that point. They were kind of starting to branch off with the computer imagery we'd see in Pixar, which quite famously they used in Rescuers Down Under and started ramping up until Pixar split off. But really, that version of Little Mermaid, Disney 1989 Little Mermaid, is so different from the Hans Christian Andersen story, even just in tone, that it feels different. The happy ending is quite different. The story of how the families and people interact just feels different. There's something so very different about it. I would label it a good adaptation. Now there are people that disagree. The more kind of hindsight we get into that Little Mermaid, the more people really want to break down the story in modern terms. They want to talk about how Ariel doesn't have any agency. They want to talk about the damage the Princess Brand does um, to feminism. They want to really take the adaptation not on its own terms, but in modern sensibility. And maybe in '89, that was a conversation we should have had. Um, but as someone that loved Little Mermaid, I think because the people that came from Broadway did it, I feel like I give them maybe a pass on some of that feminism. Here's the thing about adapting stuff from fairy tales. There wasn't a lot of feminism in those times, so adapting things from fairy tales can sometimes you kind of have to either talk about it completely or ignore the elephant in the room. So when we talk about Cinderella, there are versions of Cinderella that really acknowledge it, and there are versions that don't acknowledge it at all, but try to grapple with it. So, like the live action Cinderella Disney did, tried to grapple with the sexism and tried to grapple with people talking about Cinderella's character and how she doesn't have any agency either, just like Ariel. Which I don't know is true necessarily. I think there is a specific beat for Cinderella where she is actively choosing to honor the wishes of someone who's passed on. And I think in a way it is a story about grief and about moving on. And we'll talk more about that as I kind of open up my own story. So you've got like the Cinderella with Cate Blanchett and Lily James and the guy that played Prince Kit. And this is a version of Cinderella that acknowledges the sexism of the film. I'm not sure if air quotes is appropriate or not, but it acknowledges the sexism of the film, of the story, but doesn't really do much with it, right? It just kind of is. It makes like a half-hearted attempt. And in a way, this version of Cinderella is kind of, someone described it as a confectionery where it looked really good, but really wasn't doing much. And so for a lot of people, it's not the best adaptation. It's not the one they enjoy. It's not the one they gravitate toward. Now, some people really like it. So again, when I say bad adaptation, it may be some people really fight for it. Some people really love the costuming, and that's important to them. A great thing about adaptation is knowing the story means that you can look critically at other aspects of it. So that's something adaptation gives you in freedom. It's something that works in fan fiction too a lot. Um, but then you get really good versions that either modernize the story, they really tackle head on the issues that are kind of glaring in the story. And I'm going to give three examples here to think about. So the first is Ever After, which is the Drew Barrymore, Anjelica Huston one, which instead of the fairy godmother and magic, I think it's Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo that creates the dress that Danielle wears. It gives Danielle a name that's not Cinderella. And that is a pretty, most people agree that's probably one of the best adaptations. The fight between Anjelica Huston and Drew Barrymore, and the whole ball scene, the fact that it mixes medieval with pastiche, giving Danielle a lot of agency and a lot of power to speak her truth, and giving the prince sort of a personality as well, because Danielle doesn't work if there's no prince to like kind of battle with verbally. That's a pretty good adaptation. The other really good adaptation would be the first Cinderella story, the Hilary Duff, Chad Michael Murray version. This is sort of a pop adaptation, sort of new pop, sort of in that Mean Girls modern day vein. This is the one that really highlights, not, it highlights the love story, but it really highlights more the evil stepmom trope. It really knew who it was casting and worked that way. And again, this is an adaptation that doesn't do magic. It doesn't do a fairy godmother. My favorite version is Cinderella 97 with Brandy and Whitney Houston, and that goes well into the magic. And that's sort of an adaptation of an adaptation because it's very much more like the old telecast of Cinderella they used to do, which is when Julie Andrew was Cinderella, and I think Mary Martin played the fairy godmother. I could be wrong about that, but it's this whole thing of everyone, when you see an adaptation, you have a response to it because you have familiarity with the story. So it gives you permission to look beyond that and look at other things, either critically or with love or with nostalgia or thinking that's just really neat. Kind of the best way to segue from what adaptation is into why I'm adapting it, or kind of what my handhold is into it that I've sort of realized as I've worked, is probably Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods. Now, Into the Woods did also get a Disney live action adaptation. It's a live action stage show, but it got a live action adaptation instead of a CGI. There was CGI, but it wasn't like Cats on the CGI. So Into the Woods really is this interesting dichotomy as a story. So as it goes, it is about fairy tales, but the baker and his wife, who are the center of the story, act like normal people. That was the crux for Stephen Sondheim, is they were normal people in this world filled with fairy tale creatures. And so in this case, this Cinderella is much closer to the Grimm brothers. The graphic scenes, where you don't see too much blood, but you see blood from literally the stepsisters like chopping off their heels and toes to try to fit into the magic shoes. By the way, the shoes were magic. They weren't just glass. They were only supposed to fit on Cinderella's feet. So all the people that make a big deal about the shoe, you're missing that in that it's only supposed to fit on Cinderella's feet. It's a part of the lore. It's a real thing. Like if that's your adaptation gripe, you're really not trying to find something to either enjoy or dislike that actually matters. That's the first thing. Um, so Into the Woods, I didn't realize Into the Woods was influencing Cobblestone Kingdom until just recently. For me, I was really kind of hung up on adapting it to queer the love story. Something big in my art practice is kind of filling in things that we don't have for queer culture. A big thing that didn't really exist for a long time, is still relatively new, is the idea of gay people getting a happy ending. Um, Even in things that are queer affirming, like Billy's first Hollywood screen kiss, doesn't really get a happy ending. I can think of a few off the top of my head, like The Sum of Us is ambiguous but gives a happy ending. The Birdcage does give a happy ending after a very hard show. And when I talk about The Birdcage, because I eventually will, it's a very hard movie for me to watch for a lot of reasons, as someone who expresses more femme sometimes. Um, but I did not realize how much Into the Woods was influencing my story because in the first couple of versions, and I'm on version 5 now, because this is one thing to know. This is the first thing to know about theater work is the final play you read is never the final product it started as. So I'm currently on version 5, which means I have at least 4 previous full versions of the show. And version 5 is still too big. It will have to be cut down for a 2.5 hour performance. But it's purposely big in knowing that it will have to be cut down and some stuff will end up on the cutting room floor that I really like. Just that is the nature of the beast, of the finite time, of the amount of time an audience is willing to spend. Um, so it started out as me wanting to adapt a queer love story that had these medieval elements, that had hope to it, that would end with a happily ever after. Before I did any work about why do the characters do what they do, before I did any work about setting, before I did any work about all of the hard work that I had to do with the stepmother and Cinderella characters, which we'll get to eventually in a future week. The first thing for me was about it as a queer love story. For me, that expresses itself as a prince and a male version of Cinderella. I am working with how do I express that in the script? How do I give permission beyond a playwright note? Where if you want to do it as a sapphic love story, you can do that. And the week we talk about pronouns, I'm really going to get into this because it's a much longer conversation. And it's a conversation I didn't really get to have in theater. And I'm hoping to kind of push for. So if the conversation is happening, I can at least get into the room to hear it. But so for me at the beginning, in the first 2, 3 drafts, it really was about the romance. So I was using a lot of the markers of the story. You know, Cinderella is poor and downtrodden and goes to the ball, finds the prince, they dance, they fall in love. Yay! And I was kind of willing in the first couple of drafts to just let it be that. Really, for me, the important part of the story was they're dancing and they fall in love. And everything that has happened before that love kind of starts to heal. You know, it is not a perfect story by any means. There is lots of things it doesn't cover. Into the Woods arguably is a little better about the PTSD and trauma because of how often Cinderella runs off from her prince. I think Into the Woods, the stage show, is pretty fabulous. And you can say a lot about the Disney live action movie, but I actually think Anna Kendrick and Chris Pine as Cinderella and Cinderella's prince did a fabulous job. I think the two princes and Cinderella and Rapunzel were standouts, really, of the show. And of course, Meryl Streep. So it started out really as me just straight adapting the love story. I've done the same with Beauty and the Beast. I have a version of the Beauty and the Beast. I'm eventually going to shop around where the Beast is more of a fallen angel archetype instead of a beast. And that's a little more leaning into sort of gothic realism architecture. For Cobblestone Kingdom, this is a play. I actually say this in the notes. This is about a play. You are seeing the artifice. It doesn't need to look realistic. I don't know that I necessarily want it to be an immersive thing, but maybe that'll lend itself to the artifice. So for me, in the first few drafts, I was using adaptation to really fill in and create a love story I wanted to see. And granted, I come from it as a cis white queer male. And so there's lots of work that I have to do within that. There'll be a lot of unexpected things that come up with adaptation. Um, Something that adaptation gives me in the liberty of working in the story is when something is wrong, I can look at the beat of the story and say, this exists, and this has existed as this. There has always been a stepmother in some form in these stories. So the question is why? What purpose does she serve? Does it work in my story? And the answer for me was no. So in my version of Cinderella in Cobblestone Kingdom, there is no evil stepmother. There are characters that give that same beat, so that journey is a little similar in getting Cinderella to the ball, but it's a different character. They do different work. So when I talk about Marceline and I talk about the Ravens, I'll talk a little bit about the function of villains and how they advance the plot and how, especially in a high fantasy Cinderella adaptation, it was pretty easy to kind of sketch them out. But the first thing to know about adaptation, and why Cinderella, is these beats are familiar. I think I read somewhere that Cinderella was the most adapted story of all time, which even when we're critical of it, even when the adaptation tries to answer questions of why doesn't Cinderella just leave? Why does the slipper fit only one way? Or when you're trying to parody it and be funny with Nick Jonas and SNL, or SNL doing the Real Housewives of Disney. So Cinderella is like I think she was like a permissive drunk. I can't remember. Um, there's this really interesting thing where no matter what you do, people can kind of gravitate toward an adaptation because they know what to expect. It's that I can't think of, and I don't think there necessarily can be, because it sort of breaks the story. If there's a version of Cinderella where she doesn't get a happy ending, even in Into the Woods, where it's not a happy ending and a large portion of the extraneous cast has either disappeared or run away or been outright murdered, um, Cinderella still gets a happy ending on her own without a prince. She decides she's going to work in the bakery. She's sort of free from her evil stepmother. In the Lily James live action Cinderella, she has this great moment with Cate Blanchett on the staircase, a la Mildred Pierce without the slapping, and then she goes off and she gets her happy ending. Whitney Houston sings to Brandy and Paula Montalban. So there's sort of this expected. I was really drawn to the expected happy ending aspect of Cinderella. I think that's part of why I chose it, because it almost feels like there has to be a guarantee for all the things she goes through. And I think the things that she goes through are important. I think there's an element to specifically Cinderella when you dig beneath the story, when you look at why she's paralyzed and why she's facing all this. And this is something that when I'm translating the character to he, especially in version 4, I really started grappling with is why does he stay? Why does where he is in that status quo, even though it's undesirable, why does that matter? And something great about adaptation is it allows me to grapple with was it a medieval attitude? Was it about grief? Was it a combination? Was it a hoping things will get better? Is it about who the character of Cinderella is? The question really is, which is sort of the same question about Ariel transforming herself into a human, saying yes to see, which is why do they do what they do? And what adaptation allows you to do, and why adaptation, is because it allows you to take a familiarity and really, in a good adaptation, ask the question. Into the Woods works because each of the characters, even the kind of stock characters like Jack's mom, they don't know they're fairy tale characters, but Stephen Sondheim, as a mind to ask questions, creates an Into the Woods something really special and unique. Red Riding Hood's story is about blossoming into womanhood and making a choice, and it, it is quite an aggressive tete-a-tete in a way for her. Cinderella doesn't have quite the same story, but Cinderella's story is really about becoming okay not with the status quo and making a choice for yourself. And I think that's something that in adaptation of Cinderella, a good adaptation, it grapples with. Now, it's something that in the 97 Cinderella, it doesn't grapple with as much. I think it does a little bit. Bernadette Peters singing Falling in Love with Love and the Stepsisters Lament, those two songs sort of give a glimpse into it. So even though it's the one I love, I know it's a little bit artificey. Um, but a really good adaptation like Ever After, for instance, or even a Cinderella story with Hilary Duff, where instead of I have to leave, it's she can't leave until she gets into college. And that becomes a part of the B plot. It's a really effective adaptation. If you haven't watched the Hilary Duff, Chad Michael Murray, but the stepmom, it's the blonde stepmom. It's the lady from Legally Blonde. What's the Hot Dog Real Bad? Name I'm forgetting. I'm sorry, all the gays watching this. It's this really interesting thing of they were able to find an answer to the she's stuck, and it had to do with that caste system of high school. It's why One Tree Hill and Glee and Boston Public are all set in high school, because it gives you a very, very strong base. People have an expectation of high school. Yeah, so it's an interesting thing of the adaptation allows you to look at the questions unasked and ask them, or it allows you to ignore them completely and just make something either very pretty or very gritty. You could also look at the different versions of Alice in Wonderland. There have been from the TV Alice in Wonderland that had 2 disaster seasons, though I did love it dearly as a kid, to the Tim Burton version of Alice, which is very different and is very Burtony. I think there might even be an Alice in Wonderland with the Muppets. Anytime the Muppets do anything, it's really good because they're very aware of what they're doing and they really don't do anything by halves. It's why Muppet Christmas Carol works so well. It's why people keep having this yearning for Muppet Les Mis, which is kind of an interesting thought. Yeah, so first question is why adaptation? And the answer is it's because it's a familiar story. The ironic thing is that there are kind of boxes that you have to check, but you can always ask yourself, why am I checking those boxes? What does this serve to the story? Do I need this in my version? Do I need to set Cinderella in a medieval, or can I set it in modern day Beverly Hills? You know? And when you go forth boldly looking at questions and ideas, that can really illuminate a lot of things. And so when you think about adaptations you like, or things you don't even know are adaptations that you're drawn to, people like Little Women especially take umbrage with the most recent adaptation because the hairstyles were all wrong for the era and it was just too much pastiche, not necessarily done well. But some people really like that about Little Women because for them it's more about the story and they can kind of shoo off the criticisms about the hairstyles and the shoes. But for some people that are like costume people, they just can't do it because it's bad. But some people really, really like that. I would say the other version of adaptation is an adaptation that is so difficult and caustic that it's so different that it can't really be seen as an adaptation. And I'm thinking about, and I was talking about this last night with someone, is The Magicians, which is sort of this trilogy of books that was turned into a TV show on Sci-Fi. that is sort of this repudiation of everything the Chronicles of Narnia was and stood for. It went in a bit of a different direction, admittedly. So it's not a true adaptation, but it really takes the idea of using adaptation to ask questions and using it to burn down something pretty precious. Now, however you feel about Narnia or the magicians or any of that thereof, that is something to grapple with when you're looking at an adaptation. When you're seeing Wicked, close to Thanksgiving is when I think it's coming out still, you have to think to yourself, this version of Wicked is a film adaptation of a stage show, which is an adaptation of a book, which is an adaptation of a film, which is an adaptation of a serialized film slash stage show, which is an adaptation of another book. So you have to think about kind of the 14 layers and what you expect. So we know who's playing Elphaba. How does that influence how Elphaba acts, having an African American actress play Elphaba, play a green skinned character whose kind of green skin is that defying shock value, first notice thing? How does it feel to have Ariana Grande playing Belinda? How does it feel to have Dr. Dillamon look like a real goat? You know, it's things you have to deal with because a version of Wicked, not a CGI, but where it would be done claymation or puppet style, has a very different feel and does very different work. Um, you're also allowed to be excited by things that are not perfect adaptations. I want you to get permission. I want you to have the permission to know that you can like an adaptation that is not great. It's perfectly fine. Um, it's just really important to think about the fact that in adapting something, where did the person who created it, directed it, rewrote it, what questions were they asking of it? When we say Lion King is Hamlet with cats, what does that mean? What about Hamlet is still in the Lion King? And what questions does it ask of what Hamlet is? Is it about how you take your place? Is it about destiny? Is it just about some really fun songs in the jungle and then Elton John coming in the middle of it, swooping in? You know, is it about amassing found community? Uh, those are the sort of things that adaptation frees you to do. And it's why when I started my writing journey so many years ago, I started out adapting Buffy the Vampire Slayer stuff. I was looking for more queer vampires that at that time didn't really exist. Anne Rice was doing it, but I wasn't really at the Anne Rice age yet. I think I might have actually had already read Anne Rice, but I hadn't really like taken in the queerness of the vampires. I was like, oh, they're queer, and then I hadn't thought about it at all. Um, yeah, but adaptation is an exciting kind of medium to start in, and I think it's part of why in starting out doing plays, I have my straight plays that are more of my own story, but it was really important for me in doing a musical to start off with an adaptation of something that I held dear and would give me the ability to tell a queer love story, because that's adamantly at the core of what I'm doing. This is an adaptation of Cinderella in order to have a prince fall in love with a male presenting, male identified commoner. Now, I'm very excited to have the journey with people that want to do it as trans, where it might start to look really heteronormative. And what does that mean? And what does it mean to change pronouns and go from he, him to she, her and have it become a sapphic love story? Does that mean the villain then has to become male? Or is it okay to still have them be female? It's very exciting to know, but to have that baseline of this is an overt queer adaptation. And there's going to be new things about it, and there's going to be things you love and things you think are silly and things you hate. But it's something that has thoughtfully attempted and didn't even know was going to do this. Really consider the whys of the story. What about Cinderella do we keep coming back to, both in love, in criticism, in style? What about Cinderella continues to be the thing that we need to continue to see? Because whether it's done well or whether it's something that you could leave completely, it was done. Someone took time, spent money, hired actors, were hired for, and they made this product. And Cobblestone Kingdom is my adaptation of this story. It is my gift to the universe, to you, to the idea of queer romance in this sort of fantasy, high art, medieval setting. And I'm so excited to share it. I want to thank you for hanging out today and considering adaptation. And I hope next time you watch something that you either know was adapted from something else or had no idea, and then you research it and you're like, well, that's an adaptation of that, that you'll think of me. And you can start to look at it from why? Why is it being adapted this way? Why does it matter? And why does it matter to me? And if I can do that, hey, that's the start of something. I'll see you next week for more about the Thesis diet.